she inherited her late grandmother's house, but when she went up to the attic, she found not dust and old things, but traces of what the family had been hiding for decades. See how this story ends. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The letter came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a cream-colored envelope with a faint smell of dust and varnish. Marilyn Brown almost mistook it for another bank statement or real estate offer until she noticed the embossed seal in the corner, a notary office in Vermont. She hadn't seen that word, Vermont, written in her mail for over 20 years. Her fingers hesitated before tearing it open. The letter was formal, emotionless. Her grandmother, Ruth Brown, had passed away 2 months earlier. As the sole surviving descendant, Marilyn was the inheritor of the Brown family property, an old 3-story house near the town of St. Albans. It was the same house she had promised herself never to step into again. Marilyn sat at her kitchen table, coffee cooling beside her, eyes running over the lines again and again. She remembered that house the way you remember a dream you once tried to forget. Large, silent, full of whispers that weren't quite whispers. As a child, she used to spend summers there. The long wooden porch, the smell of apples and varnished floors, the way her grandfather always came in from the garden with soil on his hands and pine sap on his wrists. She also remembered the arguments that grew sharper as she got older, the night she shouted at her grandmother that she was living among ghosts. That was the last time she had been there. She left for college in Chicago and never returned. For a long while she sat, motionless, holding the letter. The words blurred. She was 42 now, divorced, a geologist consulting for a private firm, living alone in a small apartment that smelled of coffee grounds and paper maps. Her days had become measured, predictable, like the sediment layers she studied for a living. Maybe that was why the letter unsettled her. It was a reminder that time was moving under her feet, whether she wanted it or not. By noon, she had made up her mind. She would go, see the house once, handle the paperwork, and leave. The road to Vermont stretched for miles through late spring landscapes, the world slowly turning green again after winter. She crossed state lines in silence, her old Jeep humming with the steady rhythm of tires over asphalt. The further she drove, the more the landscape changed. The highways narrowed into 2-lane roads, then into gravel paths lined with birches and sagging fences. Every so often, she passed an abandoned barn or a rusted tractor half swallowed by weeds. There was something almost gentle in the decay of the countryside, a kind of acceptance she had never learned. By the time she reached the outskirts of St. Albans, the sun was beginning to set. The last stretch of road wound upward, through a line of maple trees that opened onto a clearing. There it was, the Brown house. It stood on a hill, alone, framed by overgrown shrubs and apple trees that hadn't been pruned in years. The roof sagged slightly at one corner. The paint had peeled into flakes of gray and white, and the windows reflected the fading orange sky like watchful eyes. She parked at the foot of the hill, stepping out into the cool evening air. The silence felt heavy, like a held breath. Her boots crunched over the gravel path as she approached the porch. The wood groaned under her weight. A spider's web caught the light by the doorframe. She found the key in her coat pocket, the same key the notary had mailed her with the documents. It turned reluctantly in the old brass lock, and when the door opened, a wave of stale air greeted her. Inside, the house smelled of dust, apples, and something faintly metallic, the scent of time itself. She switched on her flashlight. The power was still connected, but the bulbs flickered weakly. The front hall looked almost unchanged, the tall grandfather clock by the staircase, its pendulum frozen, the framed photographs of stern men and soft-faced women with the same brown eyes as hers, the coat rack still holding an old wool jacket, that might once have been her grandfather's. She walked slowly through the rooms, touching the edges of furniture draped in white sheets. The parlor, with its faded wallpaper, the kitchen with cast-iron pans still hanging, the narrow dining room with lace curtains stiff from dust. Each room felt preserved, as if her grandmother had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. On the table lay an envelope labeled in careful handwriting, "For Marilyn." Inside were a set of old keys tied together with twine, and a note written on yellowed paper. "Do not disturb the upper floor. It is the family's memory garden." Marilyn frowned. She didn't understand. She thought of the attic, or maybe the third floor her grandmother had sealed off decades ago. She remembered once, as a child, hearing footsteps above her at night, soft and deliberate, though her grandparents always claimed no one went up there. That night, she unrolled a sleeping bag in the living room, rather than disturb the upstairs bedrooms. The house creaked and sighed with the wind, a wooden body shifting in its sleep. She lay awake for hours listening to it breathe, half expecting to hear the familiar shuffle of her grandfather's boots on the stairs. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and restless. In the morning, the light revealed more of the house's quiet ruin. Dust motes floated through the air like fine sand. She made instant coffee on a gas stove that miraculously still worked, and took a slow walk through the yard. The apple trees were tangled and heavy with moss. A rusted bicycle leaned against the barn. The place felt untouched, sealed away from time. When she returned inside, she started sorting through papers in a cabinet under the stairs. Tax forms, letters, her grandfather's notebooks full of measurements and dates. Most were harmless relics of an ordinary life. But beneath a stack of old family photographs, she found a smaller envelope, brittle and brown, sealed with wax. On the back was a single word: upstairs. Curiosity, once awakened, rarely goes back to sleep. That evening, as dusk stretched across the yard, Marilyn carried a flashlight up the main staircase. The steps groaned under her weight. The second floor held bedrooms, her grandparents' room, still smelling faintly of lavender, a guest room with a quilt folded neatly on the bed. At the end of the hall was another staircase, narrow and steep, leading to the third floor. The door at the top was locked with a newer padlock, incongruous among the antique hinges. She remembered the keys she'd found in the envelope. One of them was ornate, its handle engraved with the letter B. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with a sharp metallic sound. The door opened reluctantly, hinges screaming in protest. She lifted the flashlight and froze. The attic was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't filled with boxes or broken furniture, but carefully arranged, as if someone had meant for it to be preserved. Wooden floors polished long ago, a single small window letting in a pale beam of light. And there, lined in 2 even rows across the floor, were flat stones, heavy and gray, their surfaces carved with names and dates. Marilyn took a slow step forward. The air smelled faintly of stone dust and old flowers. She crouched to read the first inscription: Silas Brown, 1871-1938. The next one, Margaret Brown, 1902 to 1969. Her flashlight trembled. Each stone bore the name of a family member. They weren't decorative plaques. They were real gravestones, clean, heavy, and old. Her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment she simply stood there, listening to the hollow silence pressing against her ears. It was impossible. Gravestones belonged in the ground, not in a house. The polished surfaces reflected the light like mirrors. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe her grandfather had been a mason and had kept these for repair work. Maybe they were duplicates or memorials. But the careful alignment, the cross at the far end of the room, and the dried bouquet of flowers lying beside it told another story. A faint shiver ran through her. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the half light of the attic window, watching the dust float in the air like thin smoke. This was the room her grandmother had warned her about, the one she had called the memory garden. Marilyn closed the door behind her as quietly as she could and descended the stairs, her heart pounding. Back in the kitchen, she sat for a long time, staring at her cold coffee. It wasn't fear exactly that she felt, more a deep confusion, an ache of not knowing. She tried to imagine her grandparents carrying those stones up 3 flights of stairs. For what? To preserve them? To hide them? Outside, the evening had turned violet. The house creaked again, as if stretching after long sleep. She glanced toward the ceiling. For the first time in years, Marilyn felt that the past wasn't behind her, but above her, pressing gently down through the floorboards. When she finally blew out the candle and went to bed, she didn't bother locking the door. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, she thought she heard something soft from the floor above. Not footsteps, not movement, just a long sigh that could have been the settling of wood, or memory breathing through the walls. The next morning came gray and quiet, as if the sky itself was unsure whether to rise. Marilyn woke up on the couch, her neck stiff and her thoughts heavy. The air in the living room was cool and still, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the smell of the old house reached her again, the mixture of wood, dust, and time, and the memory of what she had seen on the 3rd floor slid back into her chest like a slow, cold wave. She sat up, rubbed her face, and stared at the staircase. The door at the top of it was hidden by shadow, but she could almost feel its presence pressing through the ceiling. She poured herself coffee, the kind that tasted faintly like metal, and stood by the window while the morning fog lifted from the yard. The apple trees outside were motionless, their twisted branches still holding a few dry apples from the year before. Nothing in the calm landscape hinted at the strange secret waiting above her head. Yet the image of those engraved stones lingered, the names, the precise letters, the way they seemed to watch her without eyes. Marilyn was not someone who indulged superstition. Her life had been built on evidence, on rock layers and core samples, and the language of fault lines. But this was something that did not fit in the catalog of ordinary explanations. Still, she needed one. She couldn't let the irrational spread through her like mold. After breakfast, she found her phone and looked up the St. Albans Town Hall, planning to visit the local archives. If her family had once owned land, or if the house had been connected to an old cemetery, there would be records. There were always records. The drive into town took 20 minutes. The main street was lined with shuttered stores, a diner, and a small municipal building with a flag hanging limp in the damp air. Inside, a man in his 70s looked up from behind a counter, adjusting his glasses. His name tag read, Frank Delaney Records. Marilyn explained who she was, her connection to the Browns, and what she had found. The man's brows rose slightly, though his expression stayed polite. "The Brown family," he said, tapping the edge of his desk. "Yes, there was a cemetery once, down near the River Road, about 3 miles south of here. But that land was taken in the 70s for the highway expansion. Most of the graves were moved to Greenfield Memorial." He left for a few minutes and returned carrying 2 dusty folders. Inside were typed reports and handwritten notes. One document, dated 1973, stated clearly, "The Brown family burial ground remains relocated to Section D, Greenfield Memorial Cemetery. Headstones returned to surviving family members by request." Marilyn felt her stomach tighten. Returned. "Who requested them?" she asked. The man scanned the sheet and pointed to a name. "Silas Brown, grandson of the original owner. That would be your grandfather, I suppose." Marilyn stared at the paper for a long moment. The pieces started fitting together, not neatly, but firmly enough to hold. Her grandfather had taken the stones back, brought them here, and placed them in the attic. But why the attic? Why not the garden or a small corner of the property? Why carry each heavy piece up those narrow stairs? She left the office with copies of the documents, thanked the clerk, and drove home under a low ceiling of clouds that promised rain. Back at the house, she ate a sandwich she didn't taste, and then wandered out to the yard. The grass brushed her jeans, uncut for months, and in the distance, the apple trees swayed gently in the wind. She looked up at the roofline. The third-floor window was barely visible behind the climbing vines. Somewhere up there was her family's past, confined within wooden walls. The image both disturbed and fascinated her. That afternoon, she visited the only neighbor still living on the road, Mrs. Gray, a thin woman in her 80s, with sharp blue eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she poured tea. Mrs. Gray remembered the Browns well. "Your grandfather was a proud man," she said, sitting in her small parlor that smelled of lemon polish. "He didn't like the way the county handled things. Said they were paving over bones. He told everyone that memory doesn't belong to the government." Marilyn asked if anyone had ever seen him move the gravestones. The old woman smiled faintly. "One night he came by my husband's place, asked to borrow the flatbed truck, said he was hauling stone for the roof repairs. But the next morning, he was covered in dirt, and that truck bed was scratched to hell. We all knew, but no one said a thing. That was his land, his business." Driving back home, Marilyn could almost picture him, her grandfather in his work boots and thick coat, lifting each stone under the cover of darkness, determined to keep what was his. There was something heartbreakingly human in the act. Not madness, not ritual, just defiance, love, and maybe grief. Inside the house, the light had dimmed. She climbed to the third floor again, this time without hesitation. The air was cooler there, dry and still. Her flashlight beam glided over the stones, now less frightening than before. She knelt beside one, tracing the carved name with her fingertips. The letters were shallow but carefully done. The stone was cold and slightly rough under her skin. Her grandfather's hand must have touched this same edge, setting it down carefully. He had built this memorial to preserve what the world wanted to erase. Marilyn began to notice details she had missed before. The floor beneath the stones was reinforced with newer planks, probably added to hold their weight. There were flower petals scattered in one corner, long since dried. Near the window sat a wooden stool and a small notebook, the pages yellowed and brittle. She picked it up and read a few lines written in her grandfather's strong, deliberate handwriting. "They say the past should rest in the earth. I say the earth has turned unfaithful. If the ground cannot protect our dead, then I will give them my roof. Let them lie above me, not below strangers' tires." The words struck her more deeply than she expected. This was no insanity. It was a man's way of fighting helplessness. He had lived long enough to see his family's land reduced to asphalt and exhaust. He couldn't save it, but he could lift it out of reach. Marilyn closed the notebook and sat in silence for a while. Through the small window, she could see the faint outline of the highway in the distance, a thin silver ribbon cutting through the hills. Cars passed there, their sound faint and ghost-like. None of the drivers knew they were speeding over what used to be a family's resting place. She wondered if her grandmother had supported this act or endured it in silence. The fact that she had kept the attic locked suggested the latter. That night, Marilyn lay awake again, thinking of the attic and the weight it carried. She thought about how people in her field measured history, in layers, in strata, in inches of rock. But here, history was measured in stone slabs resting above her head. Her grandfather had turned grief into architecture. On the third day, She began going through the boxes that filled the closets on the second floor. Most contained the usual debris of old lives: yellowed linens, broken clocks, postcards from places long gone. In a box marked 1973, she found receipts for construction materials, sketches of wooden beams, and an envelope labeled "for the roof." Inside was a faded blueprint of the attic with markings and weight calculations. Her grandfather had engineered it. He had known exactly how much weight each joist could bear. It wasn't madness at all. It was precision. In the evenings, the loneliness of the house pressed in. She would sit at the kitchen table, reading the old letters under a weak lamp, feeling as though the years were folding in on themselves. The silence became a kind of companion, patient, understanding. One evening, while she was cleaning a shelf in the hallway, her hand brushed against something metallic, wedged behind a loose board. She pried it free. A small metal box with rust along the edges. The latch was stubborn, but yielded eventually. Inside were photographs, a child's drawing, and several folded pages. She recognized the handwriting instantly, her grandfather's again. The first note was simple. "For whoever returns, the stones are not graves. They are the names we refused to bury." Another page was a letter, clearly never sent. "They call it progress. They pave over our fields and tell us to forget. But forgetting is another kind of death, and I will not die twice." Marilyn's throat tightened. She imagined him sitting at the kitchen table years ago, pen scratching across paper, the sound of the highway construction echoing in the distance. His act had not been one of horror, but of preservation, a stubborn love for his dead and for the land that once held them. She carried the box upstairs and set it beside the first stone. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid. Instead, she felt connected, as if she had been given something to understand, not to escape. Days passed like that, quiet and heavy. She stayed longer than she had planned, caught between duty and discovery. She began to document everything, writing notes as if preparing a report. Approximates 15 stones, each hand-carved, structural reinforcement consistent with mid-70s lumber, evidence of care, not concealment. But when she finished writing, the page seemed too small for what the place meant. Facts could not hold the weight of emotion. The decision she would have to make started forming quietly in her mind. She couldn't leave the stones there forever. They didn't belong locked in an attic any more than they belonged under a highway. But to move them again felt like a betrayal of her grandfather's intent, of the strange peace he had built. She found herself standing in the attic late one night, whispering as if speaking to him. "I understand why you did it, but I can't live with it this way." The moonlight slipped through the window, landing across the names carved in stone. The letters gleamed pale and almost soft. Marilyn realized then that the attic wasn't just a memorial. It was a confession, a record of a man's refusal to let history disappear. When she descended the stairs again, she felt a new clarity forming, not certainty, but direction. There was a way to honor both the living and the dead, to set things right without erasing what had been done. She didn't know yet what that way would look like, but she would find it. The rain started that night, steady and slow, drumming on the roof that held her family's names. Marilyn lay awake, listening to it, and thought about the simple truth her grandfather must have known, that every family, like every rock formation, carries its own pressure, the weight that shapes it. And sometimes, to understand it, you have to dig deep enough to touch what others decided to bury. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning, a patient, steady whisper against the roof that carried her family's weight. Marilyn woke to its rhythm, the sound merging with her thoughts until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The decision that had been growing in her mind now took shape. The attic could not remain a shrine hidden above her head. It deserved air, light, and honesty. What her grandfather had done was born of love, but love, she realized, could become another form of confinement if left untouched. It was time to let the stones breathe again. She made herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the droplets race down the glass. Beyond the rain, the orchard looked alive for the first time since she'd arrived, the wet bark shining dark against the gray morning. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the stretch of highway that had stolen the family's original resting ground. The thought no longer filled her with anger. It filled her with a strange calm. She could not change what had been taken, but she could decide what to give back. Her first step was to call the St. Albans municipal office. The same clerk, Frank Delaney, answered. When she explained what she wanted to do, relocate the headstones back to the old site and establish a family memorial, there was a long pause on the line. "You'd have to file a request for reinstallation," he said slowly. "But if it's only the stones, not remains, that should be possible. You'll need a written description, photographs, and property coordinates." His tone softened. "It's a good thing you're doing. Not many people care to fix what time erases." Marilyn thanked him and spent the rest of the morning photographing each stone carefully. She recorded names, dates, even the faint cracks along their surfaces. Each photograph felt like a small act of preservation, not of death, but of truth. She worked in silence, her breathing loud in the still attic. When she lifted the last stone enough to clean beneath it, she noticed something small wedged between the planks. A coin. It was old, tarnished, its engraving nearly gone, but she recognized the year 1938, the same as her great-grandfather's death. Perhaps her grandfather had placed it there as a token, a symbol of passage. She slipped it into her pocket. That evening she drove into town to buy supplies, cleaning cloths, gloves, rope, and marking paint. At the hardware store, the clerk, a middle-aged man named Tom, recognized her family name immediately. "You're one of the Browns," he said. "Used to see your grandfather come in for lumber all the time. Quiet man, strong as a horse." When she told him what she was doing, his expression turned respectful. "If you need a hand moving those stones, I've got a flatbed and 2 good arms." She didn't expect help, but the offer lingered. The next morning, Tom arrived with his truck and his teenage son. Together they carried the stones down from the attic, one by one. It was grueling work. Each slab was heavy and slick from years of dust, the carved edges biting into their gloves. Yet there was something reverent about the effort. They worked in near silence, the rain having finally stopped, the air filled with the smell of wet earth and wood. When the last stone was loaded, Marilyn climbed into the truck beside Tom. The drive to the old burial ground took them along the road that had once been the family's land. The highway loomed to their left, its constant hum a reminder of what had been paved over. They stopped near a small patch of grass between the road and a wooded slope. Frank had marked it on a map as the closest accessible location to the original cemetery. It wasn't perfect, but it was open ground, and the soil felt firm beneath her boots. They unloaded the stones carefully, arranging them in a semicircle facing the trees. Marilyn cleaned each one with a damp cloth, the engraved letters slowly emerging from years of dust and attic gloom. The names looked different out here, under the open sky. They were no longer relics hidden away, but words rejoining the earth. She ran her hand across the stone bearing her grandfather's name and whispered a quiet thank you. By late afternoon, her muscles ached, and her clothes were streaked with dirt, but she felt lighter than she had in years. When Tom and his son left, she stayed behind, sitting on the grass as the light faded. The highway murmured in the distance, But above it rose the sound of wind through the trees, a gentler rhythm, timeless and forgiving. She stayed until the first stars appeared, then stood, brushing soil from her hands. "It's done," she said softly. Back at the house, the emptiness of the attic struck her immediately. Without the stones, the floor looked bare, almost fragile. She could see the lighter patches of wood where they had rested, the marks of weight that had pressed down for decades. Yet the space felt larger, not lonely. It breathed differently now. She opened the window to let in the night air. Over the next week, she devoted herself to restoring the house. She cleared the dust from the stairway, repaired broken boards, and replaced the cracked glass in the attic window. The physical work steadied her. She found herself humming as she painted, sometimes speaking aloud to the ghosts of memory that no longer frightened her. She transformed the attic into something new, her own workspace. Against the far wall, she placed a wooden desk that had belonged to her grandfather, sanding it until the surface shone again. She arranged her geological samples, notebooks, and maps across it. In the corner, she left one stone, the smallest one, bearing her grandfather's name. It stood upright by the window, catching the morning light. Not as a grave, not as a secret, but as a sign of continuity. Spring deepened into early summer. The apple trees blossomed, their petals drifting across the grass like pale snow. Marilyn spent her mornings writing, and her afternoons tending to the garden that had once been wild. Neighbors began to visit, curious at first, then quietly supportive. Some brought photographs of the Browns, old newspaper clippings, or stories about her grandfather's generosity during harsh winters. They no longer spoke of the strange house on the hill. It had become, once again, a home. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the municipal office. Her request had been approved officially. The patch of land by the woods was now registered as the Brown Family Memorial. Attached was a small printed plaque design that she could choose to install if she wished. She smiled as she read the document, then folded it neatly into her notebook. It wasn't the official seal that mattered. It was the act itself, the acknowledgement that her family's story had been returned to the map. As summer ripened, Marilyn organized a small gathering. She invited Tom, Mrs. Gray, the clerk Frank, and a few others from the town who had known her grandparents. They stood together on the hill one warm evening, looking out toward the orchard as she told the story, the relocation of the graves, the attic, the love and stubbornness that had built it all. Her voice trembled at times, but not from sadness. It was the tremor of understanding. When she finished, they walked to the site of the memorial. The stones glowed faintly in the low light, their carved names now surrounded by grass and wildflowers she had planted days before. No one spoke for a while. Then Mrs. Gray said softly, "He'd be proud, you know. You gave them back their ground." Marilyn nodded, her eyes stinging. "And I think I gave this place back to itself." That night, she returned to the house alone. The air inside felt alive with quiet energy. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the banister polished smooth from generations of use. On the attic floor, moonlight poured across the boards. The single stone by the window gleamed like silver. She sat at her desk, opened her journal, and began to write. Not about geology or the movement of the earth, but about the movement of memory. She called the piece, "The Geology of Memory," how we build above what we lose. She wrote until the early hours, words flowing easily, as though the house itself whispered them. She wrote about her grandfather's defiance, her grandmother's silence, her own journey from skepticism to reverence. She wrote about how families, like landscapes, shift under pressure, but retain the traces of every layer. And she wrote about letting go, not by erasing the past, but by giving it space to stand in the light. When she finally stopped, The sky outside was beginning to pale. The first birds called faintly from the orchard. Marilyn set down her pen and looked around the attic. It was no longer a place of secrecy or burden. It was simply a room in a house, filled with air, light, and the quiet hum of life returning. In the weeks that followed, her story spread through the town. A small article appeared in the local paper. Old brown house restored. Family memorial reclaimed. People who had once whispered about the strange woman on the hill now came to visit, to see the garden, to hear the story firsthand. Marilyn welcomed them all with tea and an easy smile. By autumn, the leaves had begun to turn. The orchard burned with gold and red, and the air carried that faint sweetness of decay that always made her think of time doing its slow, merciful work. One evening she stood on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. The house behind her was quiet, steady, alive. She thought of the generations before her, of their stubborn love for this patch of land. "I used to think memory was something you carry," she said aloud to the twilight. "But maybe it's something that carries you." Inside, the attic window caught the last of the light, and the name carved in the single stone gleamed softly as the day faded. The house no longer pressed down with the weight of the past. It stood balanced, breathing its roots deep in history, its windows open to the sky. And Marilyn, finally, felt the same. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other videos on the channel. Each has its own story waiting for you. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who'd appreciate it.